We ask the questions. What is needed in the world?
Rediteljica i novinarka Myriam Francois među rijetkim je osobama na Zapadu koje vatreno zagovaraju palestinsko oslobađanje od izraelske okupacije i podižu svijest o istini u Palestini. Osnovala je i produkcijsku kuću MPWR Productions kako bi dala platformu glasu i pravima ugnjetavanih manjina. One World Media nominovao ju je 2021. kao jednog od 14 svjetskih filmskih autora koje treba gledati. Francois za Al Jazeeru govori o izraelskoj genocidnoj misiji u Gazi, etničkom čišćenju na Zapadnoj obali, te kako izraelski cionisti neće stati samo na Palestini.
Myriam, welcome to the Al Jazeera Balkans program.
Thank you for having me.
So, as a member of the jury of the 7th AJB DOC Film Festival, which documentaries do you find a must-see, as, you know, educational urgency for the times we are living in?
So honestly, a really hard question, because I do think that the selection that was made for the festival was incredible. It covered so many bases. I mean, it covered, you know, everything from ongoing Russian, Chinese and Western imperialism, all the way through to issues around single mothers and the challenges that they face, to abandoned working class communities. You know, there's a lot that these films reveal about the world, and it's, you know, it's why I got into filmmaking, it's why I love film. So to select one is, of course, very difficult. There is, of course, the winner, which is Smiling Georgia. I announced that, of course, in the knowledge that it's a film that I think speaks to many of the issues in the region. It speaks to the absolutely and astoundingly beautiful film that was created. And to the wider issues of injustice that it touches on. You know, it's a beautifully made film about very serious issues, and I think that probably is the combination that we all aspire to as filmmakers. And of course, I'd be amiss if I didn't mention films like While the Olive Trees Weep or Holy Redemption, which are films that touch on the genocide in Gaza, that reveal aspects of what's happening right now that many people may not be familiar with, whether that's the continuity in the genocide and the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinian people, and therefore the continuities with what's happening now, or issues around Jewish extremism and the way it's become embedded within Israeli polity and policies today.
This is not your first time in Bosnia and Herzegovina, right? You have been here before as a filmmaker and as a journalist. So what was the reason of your previous visit?
My first visit was in 2015. I came with the BBC to make a documentary called Srebrenica Revisited. It was essentially about bringing a group of young people who were all born in the same year as the genocide to find out about it, because the truth is this is a genocide, Srebrenica, that many people in Western Europe don't actually know about. I mean, it's very shameful to say that, because we are sat today in somewhere that is 2 hours flight from London. But the reality is that many people don't know what happened here. And I think that what was revealed for me in the documentary was that when people do become aware of what was ongoing here, it leads them often to reflect on the continuities between certain forms of behaviors, whether that's extreme forms of nationalism, whether that's forms of Islamophobia that can turn into dehumanization of entire communities and justify violence against them.
Talking about the lessons learned, when we reflect on genocide in Bosnia and Herzegovina, do you see the same or similar pattern in Palestine, and what is different this time? When it comes to the West and the way they perceive and know actually about what is actually going on in Palestine?
Yes. Well, I think, look, there's clearly parallels in a number of ways that, you know, Bosnian writers and intellectuals and other filmmakers have spoken about, so I couldn't, you know, reference that. But I think certainly the extent to which there is a clear disdain for the loss of life a hierarchy of human value, a sense that some deaths are strategically acceptable. You know, that was the truth then, it is the truth now, that there is a cost being calculated that is deemed to be acceptable to those who have the capacity to stop it. But I also think that there is something wider, of course, in the continuities of the communities that are being targeted. Of course, not all Palestinians are Muslims. Palestinians are also Christians. And of course, I always make this point that Palestinians being people, they are atheists, they are, you know, maybe non-denominational, spiritual. They are just people, so they will have the whole gamut of beliefs like anybody else does. But we tend to assume, because of the way that they're represented, that they are, you know, one big Muslim bloc. And I'm sure that there's probably continuities there with how the Bosnian community is represented. You know, this idea that it was these Muslims, this, you know, this reference as if everyone is extreme. The first stage of the
classification of people, that's the first stage of genocidal process.
Right. And this assumption that everyone is somehow extreme by kind of the proximity to Islam. And I find that obviously as a Muslim really perturbing, because those patterns are very evident today. They're evident in Gaza, they are evident in the way that we talk about what's happening, and they're evident, unfortunately, in the way that we talk about Muslim communities throughout Europe.
Mm-hmm. We mentioned classification of people in the first stage of genocide out of 10 stages. Then dehumanization, and then persecution, execution. And the last stage of a genocidal process is denial of the perpetrator. So how do you explain the fact that when Israel is accused of committing a crime or war crimes, the US asks Israel to investigate its own crimes over and over?
Yeah. Well, first of all, it's worth stating that Israel's investigations of itself yield less than a 1% prosecution rate. However, the prosecution of Palestinians in military courts is over 99%. Those statistics in and of themselves suggest that we're not looking at a justice system by any name that could be recognizable, objectively speaking.
So why there is no independent international investigation on these crimes, on Israeli crimes?
Well, look, Leyla, I'll be completely frank with you. I think it's a mistake to think of Israel separately to the United States. Israel was often thought of by Arab and Palestinian intellectuals as a US military base in the region. There are strategic reasons why you might want to separate the two. And one would be, for example, that you could stand in America and claim to represent the bastion of human rights and democracy and freedom of speech and all the rest of it. And so you could continue to purport to stand for those values whilst arming financially and militarily a genocide in Gaza. And the way that you do that, of course, is to create a distinction between the two entities, which means that when we then bring any case against Israel to international courts, then America is able to veto any sanctions, any accountability, and so continue to essentially money launder US money through Israel back into the military-industrial complex in the US through this sort of charade that, well, we're trying to account Israel, but we just can't do it. Well, you absolutely could do it. You could just not veto every attempt to hold them accountable. But you would only do that, of course, if there was a disalignment between the two countries. And I think that that in itself is part of the fast that we are asked to swallow.
One more thing that we are asked to swallow is the moral equivalency, which actually Noam Chomsky is calling that's a plain and simple propaganda, that's avoiding responsibility for one's acts. What we do need is moral consistency. So to avoid the equalization of the occupied and occupier and cause and consequence, let's say like this. Are the Western media, because you're coming from the UK and you have also connections with France and let's say Ireland, is the Western media morally mature, let's call it like this, to follow this principle?
I mean, the Western media is a reflection of Western societies in which we have hierarchies of human value built into them. You know, the West in many ways was built on a culture of white supremacy, the notion that in order to create strategic advantages for European countries, that colonies and the people within them could be exploited, they could be starved, they could be maimed, and they could be killed. And that principle was, of course, the enduring facet of the colonial era. But in many ways, you could argue, as many intellectuals have, that rather than thinking of colonialism as simply having ended, we could think of colonialism as one part of an imperial project, which has morphed to adapt to the different eras in which it exists. And so today we continue to have forms of imperialism throughout the world. Of course, America and the West more generally are not the only imperial powers in the world. Of course, in this region, you're very aware of that. But they certainly continue to be a strong imperial force. And I think as such, what you find is that the media operates as a lubricant, a social lubricant for the policies that remain advantageous to the West. You know, we need justifications for invading other countries if we are going to benefit from access to their resources, whether that's, you know, sending 6-year-old Congolese children down mines so that we can have very expensive, but apparently less expensive than it would otherwise be, iPhones, or be it access to oil and other resources.
A classical manufacture of consent. Talking about
Chomsky said it best.
Exactly. Also, one thing that a former UN official, Craig Monkeyber, pointed out is that the mainstream media are a mechanism of Gaza's genocide. So this is the UN official. To what extent, you just touched upon these things, but to what extent does mainstream media support the genocidal campaign of the far-right Israeli parties?
I mean, look, there's multiple ways in which I think Western media outlets continue to be complicit. The first, and perhaps the one in which I'm most angry about as a journalist and filmmaker, is the absence of clear solidarity with our colleagues. I mean, that has improved. We have seen, you know, a number of media organizations denounce the lack of access, for example, to Gaza for the international media. But the truth is, if it was, you know, 160 white journalists killed in Gaza today, many of them directly targeted, sometimes alongside their families, simply for trying to report the truth of what's happening to them, I believe we'd be seeing not only a far greater outcry, but we'd be seeing forms of media protest. I think we'd be seeing blackouts. I think we'd be seeing shutdowns. I think we'd be seeing real rebellions within media organizations against this sort of placid acceptance of the idea that, oh, well, we can't access Gaza, so we have to sort of accept the IDF narrative when it comes to us. Particularly things like, you know, the idea that we're going to report the IDF's own investigation of its crimes as if this was somehow a reference point this many months in, after so many revelations of not just discrepancies, but clear lies and propaganda being used by the Israeli government. So to me, at this point in the conflict, it should be very clear that the only way to deal with Israeli officials in interview settings is to regard them as mouthpieces of a propaganda machine during a genocide. And I can assure you that if we did do those interviews in those conditions, they would look entirely different to the ones that we have currently. And that, to me, speaks to many things. It speaks to the implicit racism, which affords a certain level of innocence to white people in a way that it wouldn't to a, you know, a black military leader or to an Arab dictator. It also speaks to the fact that there is an implicit assumption that the Jewish state is just like us. Well, all people are just like us. Yeah. They are as much like us as anybody else, and as such, indeed, they are very much like us in the West. They have as many genocidal tendencies as we have had historically, and we appear to be offering them the same cover as we have afforded ourselves for the centuries of ethnic cleansing, genocide, and exploitation of peoples around the world. So in many ways, it's completely understandable why Israel gets a much freer ride in the Western media than it really should, but that doesn't make it any more acceptable. And I think the real price that we're paying is that there is an entire generation of young people who no longer believe anything that the mainstream media has to say. And whilst, you know, many people might say, oh, well, you know, this was happening, people were turning to digital sources, they were turning to different kinds of moral authorities when it comes to understanding the world, I personally think that's an immense loss. And I would ask my colleagues very directly, why are we accepting the full dismantling of not only an international order, but a trust in the very institutions that we represent to protect Israel? What are we protecting here? What is being protected when Israel is being ring-fenced like this?
And what could be the underlying interest?
I have my own theories on what's being ring-fenced when we protect Israel. I alluded to the fact that I do not think it's intellectually cogent anymore to think of Israel as a separate entity to America, which is, of course, the largest imperial power in the world today, although, of course, it's getting a run for its money from China. But for now, it remains the largest imperial power, and such Israel today should and has remained its strategic base in that region. And of course, as we know, today America is producing more oil domestically than Saudi Arabia. There is a run for certain resources which are running out, and we are aware that there is a necessity to secure those resources, just like there was, you know, when there were no WMDs in Iraq.
Talking about the media, we have to talk about the media accountability as well. If we remember, the news media outlets in 1994 played a crucial role in Rwanda genocide, and journalists and editors, that is media propagandists, went on trial and they were prosecuted for inciting genocide and crimes against humanity. So could we see the same justice against the warmongering media in the case of Palestine?
I mean, in theory, the answer should be yes, because I do think that we have seen the same incitement to genocide by certain columnists, by certain outlets, and certainly in the failure to properly hold to account genocidal statements by leaders that I do believe are now going to be used as part of the ICJ case against Israel. So in theory, the answer should be yes. But do I believe that the same norms that are being applied to, you know, African people will be applied to the editors of The Sun or the managing director of the BBC? I mean, we can dream.
The social media is burning, let's say, when it's up to the Palestine cause and what is happening in Gaza about the genocide there. And nowadays with social media, it's easier to debunk Hasbara, you know, the Israeli Zionist propaganda and narrative, because there is no, at least full online control over the narrative there. So how does the social media help dig out the truth that Israeli far right is trying to bury? And how does the battle of algorithms manifest online?
So, I mean, firstly, I would say that Hasbara for me is not just coming from the Israeli far right. The entire Israeli government today is far right. The far right are in control of Israel. So, unfortunately, you know, the far right of the far right are essentially, you know, extreme Jewish settlers who do not believe that Palestinians have a right to live in that land, let alone be present. And so I just want to clarify that, because I think there is still this attempt often in our sector to sort of single out Netanyahu, for example, as being you know, a particular example of an extremism within Israel. Well, I don't think actually that's true. I think he's very symptomatic of what are now very common attitudes. And this isn't me saying it. These are, you know, Israeli commentators, you know, even Haaretz, the Israeli newspaper, regularly features columns by Israelis themselves denouncing the ways in which far-right ideology has become normalized within Israel. And it's shocking to me, in fact, that you find far more critical articles in Haaretz than you do in our outlets that are outside of Israel.
One thing that is significant also, because you said it, if there was no social media, we would never see the footage coming from Gaza. So let's focus on that, because that changed the public and legal image of Israel itself. Because what their far-right government is doing in Gaza and now in the West Bank can never go unseen. Once you see it, you cannot unsee it. So the state of Israel is faced with the accusation of genocide before the International Court of Justice, the same court that declared Israel also as an apartheid state. This is quite different from what the world has been hearing about Israel being the only democracy in the Middle East. International Criminal Court issued applications for arrest warrants for Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu and the Minister of Defense Gallant. You mentioned also Israeli settlements and settler violence that also came into focus. So this decades-long Israel's brutality towards Palestinians is finally coming to the light. Do these facts bring Israelis closer to truth, or push them even further into isolation and deeper their feeling of self-victimization?
Well, unfortunately, from what I gather from my Israeli contacts, is that most Israelis are not seeing the same things that you and I might be seeing on social media. And again, this is another reason why, as much as I'm grateful that we have social media as a space in which we can access, you know, some videos that families are literally filming of themselves in this situation, and that is helping to shift the narrative amongst many people, we are often existing in social media in silos. And so many Israelis exist within a silo in which they are fed the notion that the world is simply against them, that this is another example of sort of widespread anti-Semitism, and that feeds this sort of victim mentality, that they are, you know, under siege again. And I think that I hold our profession entirely responsible for that. Because the truth is, if we were doing our jobs properly and holding Israel accountable, just like any other state, then Israelis would have to be faced with the reality of what Israel's facing. When we ring-fence them, we help you know, reinforce this notion that they have that somehow what's on social media is just propaganda, you know, anti-Jewish propaganda. We have created that situation. We have allowed that to happen. If we were doing our job properly, Israelis would be confronted with the reality of what they're doing. It's our failure that has led to this. So, I mean, I guess there's two things there. One is, you know, as someone who lived in the region, I see that the ethnic cleansing of Palestine is speeding up. So we are, as much as there is some form of awakening happening globally to what is happening in the occupied territories, there is simultaneously a speeding up of the ethnic cleansing and the land grabs. And so, unfortunately, as things currently stand, there is, and we heard, of course, the US representative at the UN recently saying that she does not believe that the elements are there
For the statehood.
for Palestinian statehood today. Well, if by that you mean contiguous land, there has not been contiguous land in Palestine for a very long time, arguably since 1967. So that in and of itself is an issue that needs resolving. But things, of course, have only worsened since then. We are now seeing that Palestinians essentially today are increasingly living in enclaves. In fact, you might say that Israel is doing what America did to its indigenous population, which is reducing them to reservations, depoliticized reservations. And in fact, this is something I've heard touted as a so-called solution in Washington. So I don't think that we should be naive about the direction of travel as much as people are aware and outraged about what is happening. The facts on the ground today, as they continue as we speak, is the increasing encroachment on any remaining Palestinian land and a clear attempt at a full land grab before any final intervention, which eventually, of course, will have to come in whatever form it does. But my sense is that there has been an agreement made between Israel and the US about what the final situation will be allowed to be, and that when we get there, there will be some kind of an agreement. America will pat itself on the back for securing that peace deal, and the Palestinians will be offered depoliticized reservations where they will be allowed to live in full dependence on Israel with nothing more really than a kind of permit to exist on what remains of their land. So I'm unfortunately not very optimistic as things currently stand. But what I would say is this. It doesn't have to be that way. It doesn't have to be that way. We are talking about a region in which the Palestinians are, of course, part of a much wider Muslim community, also known as the Ummah, that historically, you know, there are tales of, you know, a woman with hijab being harassed and an entire army being sent to protect her. We have, in our history as Muslims, the precedents for interventions in support of our brethren. Unfortunately, we have no politicians bar a few countries, and currently I can probably think of only one in the region that stands up for those principles. But unless there's some kind of serious awakening at the regional level about what's going on, we should be well aware that Israel does not intend, certainly the current government, to stop at Palestinian land. It has within its sights parts of Lebanon, the entirety of Jordan, parts of Saudi Arabia. And so I would say very clearly to the leaders of those countries, it's a very clear example of you think you can look the other way, but one day they will be at your doors. And in the case of Lebanon, they're there already. In the case of Syria, they're there already. What are we waiting for exactly? For there to be some kind of regional response to this?
Myriam, thank you for your time and thank you for your thoughts.
Thank you so much.